The day Helena Eastwood bought a woman, she was only in town for flour and salt. For 15 years, she'd lived inside a fortress of grief, her only company the ghosts of her dead family. But a hateful crowd drew her to an auction block where a captive Apache woman stood, defiant and alone. Helena had sworn off feeling anything ever again. So why is she about to risk everything she has left for a total stranger? Before we continue, subscribe now to keep these videos coming, because only your support makes more content like this possible. The winter sky was a sheet of hammered pewter, vast and indifferent. For 15 years, it had been Helena Eastwood's only constant companion. The wind, a restless spirit of the Wild West, scoured the plains, piling snow against the bones of her ranch. Each gust was a whisper of the silence that had become the architect of her life. She had lived alone for so long that the sound of another human voice felt like a memory from a different world. The ranch was her fortress, its fences a line drawn against the past, its quiet rooms a buffer against feeling. Work was her prayer, the rhythmic toil of tending her stock a litany against the grief that slept, but never truly died. Just beyond the rise where a simple wooden cross marked the grave of her husband and son. That cross was the anchor of her solitude, a testament to the family she lost and the love she had buried alongside them. The cold had gnawed deep into her supply of flour and salt, forcing the trip to town. Helena harnessed her sturdiest gelding to the buckboard, the creak of leather and jingle of brass the only sounds to break the frozen air. The town was a necessary evil, a place of noise and stares she endured with a stoicism honed by years of isolation. As her wagon rumbled down the muddy main street, a crowd gathered near the livery caught her eye. It wasn't a hanging, but the atmosphere was just as grim, thick with a prurient curiosity. Men in dusty hats and worn coats formed a crude circle, their faces a mixture of avarice and grim entertainment. At the center, on a makeshift platform, stood a woman, an Apache woman. Her hands were bound before her, her deerskin dress torn at the shoulder, but she stood with a stillness that defied her circumstances. She wasn't pleading or crying. She was a stone in the middle of a rushing, filthy creek. An auctioneer, a man with a greasy vest and a booming voice, was extolling her virtues as if she were livestock. He spoke of her strength, her youth, her potential for hard work. Helena's first instinct was to turn away, to retreat back into the safety of her silence. This was the world's ugliness, and it had no place in the ordered sanctuary she had built. But she couldn't move. Something in the woman's posture held her captive. It was the rigid set of her spine, the lift of her chin, a small, potent act of rebellion. Helena saw past the dirt and the fear in the woman's dark eyes. She saw a flicker of an unbreakable core, a spirit that refused to be extinguished. It stirred something in Helena, a long-dormant ember of compassion that felt foreign and painful. It was a feeling she associated with the past, with the home that was once full of life. This was not her fight. Her world was small, contained, and safe. Yet as a rancher bid a paltry sum, followed by a leering trapper who doubled it, a cold fire ignited in Helena's gut. This was wrong. It was a violation not just of this woman, but of something fundamental that the world had already taken from Helena once. Before she fully understood her own actions, her voice, raw from disuse, cut through the din. $100. A hush fell over the crowd. Heads turned, eyes widening as they settled on the solitary rancher. It was a fortune, more than any man there was willing to pay. The auctioneer's jaw hung slack for a moment before snapping shut. $100 from Mrs. Eastwood, he barked, his gaze sweeping the stunned faces. Going once? Going twice? He slammed his hand down on a barrel. Sold. The transaction was a blur of sordid efficiency. The trapper spat on the ground. The other men shuffled away, their spectacle ruined. Helena handed over the heavy coins, her hand steady despite the tremor in her soul. The auctioneer untied the rope from the post and handed the end to Helena. For a moment she just held it, the rough hemp a sickening link between them. Then she met the Apache woman's eyes. They were deep and dark, bottomless with a weariness that Helena recognized. But beneath the exhaustion was a defiant fire, a sharp, assessing intelligence that looked not at a savior, but at a new captor. There was no gratitude in that gaze, only a profound and challenging stillness. In that silent exchange, the carefully constructed walls around Helena's heart began to fracture. A wave of unease washed over her. This was more than a mission to save a life. It was an invitation. She had just brought the wild, unpredictable world into the one place she had kept it out. She had bought a responsibility, a presence, a mirror to her own loneliness. And she wondered with a sudden sharp pang of fear if in trying to save this woman she had just shattered her own hard-won peace forever. The journey back to the ranch was a long, frozen mile for every coin she had paid. The buckboard's wheels groaned in the deep ruts of the road, a sound swallowed by the vast, oppressive silence of the plains. Helena kept her eyes fixed on the gelding's ears, a familiar sight in an utterly unfamiliar world. Beside her, the Apache woman, Miranda, sat as still as a carved figurehead on a ship sailing into oblivion. She did not shiver from the cold, though the wind tore at her thin deerskin dress. Her gaze was distant, scanning the horizon, not with hope, but with the grim assessment of a prisoner memorizing the walls of a new cell. The Wild West, which had been Helena's solitary kingdom for so many years, now felt like a shared exile. Helena had not rescued a person. She had brought home a living, breathing embodiment of silence, one that was deeper and more wounded than her own. As the familiar silhouette of her ranch rose from the snow-swept landscape, a knot of regret tightened in Helena's stomach. This was her home, her fortress built of work and grief. The sight of it had always brought a stark sense of peace. Now it felt fragile, its sanctity breached. She pulled the wagon to a halt near the porch, the air sharp with the scent of pine and ice. Without a word, Helena climbed down, her limbs stiff and aching. She didn't look at Miranda, but she felt the woman's eyes on her, watchful and unreadable. Inside, the chill of the house was a familiar embrace. It was the cold of a place lived in by only one person, a home where the fire was lit for necessity, not for company. The air was thin with the ghosts of a life long dead, the echoes of a husband's hearty laugh, the phantom patter of a child's feet. For 15 years, Helena had lived with these ghosts in a quiet truce. She led Miranda through the main room to a small door at the back. Her hand hesitated on the latch. This room had been her son's. It had been empty for so long, a shrine of dust and memory she rarely dared to enter. Taking a shallow breath, she pushed the door open. It was sparse, containing only a simple wooden bed frame and a small window looking out onto the endless snow. Helena gestured inside, a stiff, awkward movement. Stay. The word was a thought, not a sound. The days that followed were a careful, silent orbit. Two solitary planets, accustomed to their own lonely paths, now forced into a shared system. Helena returned to the brutal rhythm of her work, her one true faith. She spent hours in the biting winter wind, her hands raw and numb as she mended the fence line where the snow had weighed it down. The repetitive strain of stretching wire and pounding posts was a comfort, a physical pain that could momentarily eclipse the disquiet in her soul. From the corner of her eye, she would see Miranda, a still figure in the doorway of the house or a shadow passing behind a window. She never approached, never spoke. She simply watched, a wary animal assessing a new territory, her torn dress a constant, stark reminder of the violence that had brought her here. Their communication was born not of words, but of small, unspoken acts that fell like quiet snowflakes into the deep drift of their shared isolation. One night, Helena noticed Miranda had not used the bed, but was curled on the floorboards near the hearth, seeking the ghost of its dying warmth. The next evening, before banking the fire, Helena laid a thick wool blanket on the floor in that same spot. She did it without looking toward the corner where Miranda sat in the shadows, then retreated to her own room. The next morning, the blanket was folded into a neat square, and when Helena stepped outside, she found the porch, usually littered with wind-blown debris, had been swept clean. This fragile truce of gestures settled over the ranch. The silence remained, but it was no longer empty. It was now filled with the weight of another's presence, the quiet hum of another's pain. A week after Miranda's arrival, Helena returned from the stables, stomping the snow from her boots. She stopped in the doorway, unseen. Miranda was standing at the main window, her back to the room. She wasn't watching the yard or the barn. Her gaze was fixed far beyond, on the distant, jagged line of the mountains that bit into the pale sky. It was a look Helena knew intimately. It was the gaze of someone staring at the horizon, trying to see a life that was no longer there. It was a longing so profound it seemed to pull the very soul from the body, leaving an aching void. In that moment, Helena saw past the auction block, past the label of Apache, and saw the universal shape of grief. It was her own, mirrored in the eyes of a stranger. A sudden, sharp fear pierced her. She had thought her heart was a barren field, incapable of feeling anything new. But she was wrong. Witnessing this woman's sorrow was like planting a seed of it in her own chest, and she wondered if she had the strength to let it grow, to learn the story behind that pain, when her own was a cross she had carried alone for so many years. The world had shrunk, pulling its white blanket up to its chin. Winter deepened its hold on the Wild West, burying the plains under a heavy, silent shroud of snow that seemed to absorb all sound. The ranch was an island in a sea of white, and the days fell into a tentative rhythm dictated by the needs of the livestock and the dwindling light. For Helena, the silence she had once cultivated as a shield was now something else entirely. It was a shared space, a quiet pact between two women who had no words for the grief they carried. In the steam and animal warmth of the barn, a new language was being forged. It was a language of work, spoken in the scrape of a shovel on the wooden floor and the gentle lowing of cattle. Helena, accustomed to the solitude of her chores, found herself in the unfamiliar role of teacher. She showed Miranda how to measure out the feed, how to check a hoof for stones, how to milk the cow with a firm but gentle hand. Miranda was a quick study. Her movements were economical and sure, her attention absolute. She learned not with the deference of a servant, but with the focused intensity of a survivor committing a new skill to memory. One afternoon, while grooming the gelding, their hands brushed as Helena passed the curry comb. The contact was brief, lasting no more than a second, but for Helena, it was a lightning strike on a frozen lake. A shock of warmth, of simple human connection, shot up her arm and settled deep in her chest. It had been years, a lifetime, since she had felt the touch of another person that was not accidental or transactional. The feeling was so foreign it was unnerving, a ghost limb suddenly regaining sensation. She pulled her hand back as if burned, her breath catching in her throat. Miranda gave no sign, she noticed, her focus remaining on the horse. But Helena's heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird in a cage of her own making. She began to notice the small ways Miranda claimed a space in this world. One morning, Helena emerged to find the old wooden gate to the chicken coop, which had sagged on a broken hinge for months, had been expertly repaired with a strip of leather from a discarded saddle strap. Miranda had not asked for permission. She had simply seen a need and met it. Seeing the gate swing true, silent and sturdy, Helena felt a wave of respect so profound it bordered on awe. This was not a fragile creature to be pitied. This was a woman of immense capability, a partner in the endless work of keeping life going against the harsh will of the season. With that respect came a feeling Helena had long since buried with her family, a fierce, sharp-edged desire to protect. It was different from the cold fire of principle that had made her buy Miranda at the auction. This was personal. It was a need to guard the quiet resilience she witnessed every day, to stand as a buffer between Miranda and a world that had tried to break her. This unfamiliar emotion was a crack in the dam of her grief, and she feared what might pour through. The nights remained the coldest trial. Despite the blanket, Helena could hear the faint rustle of Miranda shifting on the hard floorboards, trying to find a position that offered some defense against the chill seeping up from the earth. The sound gnawed at Helena, a physical ache in her own bones. It was a failure, a lapse in the unspoken mission she now felt so keenly. One evening, after the final chores were done and the simple meal of stew and hard bread had been eaten in their customary silence, Helena rose from the table. She went not to her own room, but to the cold, still chamber that had once been her son's. From it, she pulled a narrow cot, its canvas stretched tight on a folding wooden frame. She carried it into the main room and set it up near the hearth, where the embers of the fire still pulsed with a deep orange life. She unfolded a thick woolen blanket and laid it over the top. The act was a declaration, a line drawn in the sand of their shared home. It was an offering of comfort, of dignity, of permanence. It said, "You belong here," off the floor. Miranda watched her from the shadows, her expression unreadable. She did not move towards it, not yet. She simply looked from Helena to the cot, her dark eyes holding a universe of questions. Retreating to her own bed, Helena lay awake, staring into the darkness. She had breached her own fortress. By setting up that cot, she had moved Miranda from the periphery of her life to its very heart. She had invited this woman, this mirror of her own pain, to stay. And with that invitation came a terror that was colder than any winter wind. She was growing to care for this stranger, and caring was a risk she had sworn she would never take again. The silence from the other room was absolute, but for Helena, It was filled with the terrifying, hopeful beat of a second heart in her home. The snow fell without pause, a relentless, whispering siege that erased the horizon and muffled the world. The ranch, once a lonely outpost, had become a ship locked in a frozen sea. Inside the small cabin, the world was reduced to the crackle of the hearth and the dance of long shadows on the rough-hewn walls. The confinement, which should have felt like a cage, had instead become a crucible. Days were measured in the dwindling stacks of firewood, nights by the deepening cold that crept through the walls. For Helena, the enforced proximity to Miranda was a constant, low thrum beneath the surface of her skin, a presence that made the familiar silence of her home feel charged and strange. They had settled into the evening's quiet rhythm. The scent of wood smoke and leftover stew hung in the air. Helena sat in her worn armchair, her hands occupied with mending a leather bridle strap, the familiar work a balm for her restless mind. Across the room, Miranda sat on the edge of the cot, a still figure swathed in the fire's flickering orange light. She was not idle. Her focus was on a small piece of cottonwood, which she was methodically smoothing with a shard of stone. The small scraping sound was the only thing that punctuated the pop and hiss of the fire. For years, Helena had lived inside a silence so complete it had become a part of her. It was the language of her grief, the sound of her loss. She knew its every texture, from the hollow emptiness of the barn to the ghost-filled quiet of her own bedroom. But the silence she shared with Miranda was different. It was alive, filled with the weight of things unsaid, with the steady hum of another person's breath, another person's pain. Then, the silence broke. "Thank you." The voice was soft, not much louder than the sigh of the wind outside, yet it landed in the room with the force of a thunderclap. Helena's hands froze over the leather strap. Her head snapped up. It was the first time Miranda had spoken. Her voice was steady, without tremor, carrying a resonance that seemed to come from a place of deep stillness. She was looking directly at Helena, her dark eyes clear and direct in the firelight. For a moment, Helena could not process the sound. A human voice, spoken to her, not in the transactional grunt of a store clerk or the crude bellow of an auctioneer, but with quiet intention. It had been 15 years. 15 years of speaking only to horses and cattle, of hearing nothing but the wind and the clamor of her own memories. The sound of Miranda's voice was a key turning in a lock rusted shut. It unlocked a floodgate, the memory of her husband's laugh, deep and warm in this very room, the high, sweet chatter of her son describing a bug he'd found by the creek. A tidal wave of life and love and unbearable loss washed over her, so potent and sudden it stole the air from her lungs. A hot, painful knot formed in her throat. She wanted to say something. "You're welcome." It was nothing, but the words wouldn't come. They were trapped behind the wall of her stoicism, drowned by the sudden, violent surge of feeling. To speak would be to shatter, to let the grief she had so carefully contained for years pour out in a single ragged sob. The mission she had given herself was to survive, and survival meant silence. It meant staying alone, untouched. Miranda did not look away. Her gaze was not demanding, but patient. In her eyes, Helena saw an ancient understanding, a wisdom forged in a fire far hotter than her own. She saw a woman who knew the shape of pain and the cost of speaking. She had offered a word of thanks not as a debt owed, but as a bridge built across the chasm of their shared desolation. Helena's entire being screamed to retreat, to rebuild the wall, to retreat back into the safety of her solitary world. But looking at the woman on the cot, at her unwavering dignity, at the quiet strength that radiated from her like warmth from the hearth, Helena found she could not. This woman, who had been stripped of her home, her family, her freedom, was the one offering a connection. With a monumental effort that felt like lifting a fallen log, Helena gave a single, sharp nod. It was a small gesture, barely perceptible in the dim light, but it was everything she had to give. It was an answer, an acceptance, a confession that she had heard, and that it mattered. Miranda held her gaze for a moment longer, then gave a slight nod in return before turning her attention back to the piece of wood in her hands. The silence returned, but it was irrevocably changed. It was no longer an empty vessel. It now held the echo of a voice, the weight of a single powerful exchange. Helena stared into the fire, her heart hammering a wild, unfamiliar rhythm against her ribs. That one small kindness from Miranda had done more damage to her fortress than a decade and a half of winter storms. The carefully constructed piece she had mistaken for healing was nothing but a fragile sheet of ice over a deep, raging river. She had brought this woman here on a mission of principle, but now a terrifying new question began to form in her mind. She had spent all these years tending the grave of her dead family, believing that was her penance, her purpose. But maybe the real mission was not to honor the dead, but to learn finally how to stay and live among the living. And she feared she did not have the strength for it, this terrifying thaw that felt so much like the coming of spring. The thaw came not as a sudden torrent, but as a slow, quiet surrender. Winter released its grip on the Wild West with a sigh, the heavy white blanket receding to reveal the dark, damp promise of the earth beneath. Water dripped from the eaves of the barn, each drop a steady beat counting down the end of a long and silent siege. The air, once sharp enough to cut, now carried the scent of wet soil and returning life. For the first time in months, the sun held a genuine warmth, a gentle pressure on Helena's shoulders as she stood on the porch, watching the world re-emerge. This was the season of new beginnings, a truth she had learned to resent, for it only ever highlighted the finality of her own endings. This spring, however, was different. The silence of the ranch was no longer a hollow ache. It was filled with the quiet presence of Miranda, a presence that had become as integral to the landscape as the distant mountains. Their shared mission had moved from the confines of the barn to the open fields. The time for planting had come, and with it, a new kind of work, a new kind of communion. They worked side by side in the small plot of land Helena tilled for her garden, their bodies falling into an unspoken rhythm. It was a quiet dance performed to the music of the earth. Helena would break the soil with the spade, the familiar ache in her back a grim comfort. Miranda followed, her hands moving with a grace that seemed both innate and sacred. She would crumble the dark clods of earth, her fingers gentle, before dropping the seeds into the furrows. There was a reverence in her movements, a deep understanding of the pact between the sower and the soil. Helena watched her, and in the sure, steady motion of Miranda's hands, she saw more than just a partner in labor. She saw a strength that had nothing to do with muscle and everything to do with spirit. This woman had endured the unimaginable, yet here she was, planting seeds of life, her own unseen grave of sorrows carried with a dignity that humbled Helena. The long years of solitude had etched their story onto Helena's face, a map of loneliness and loss. Miranda saw it. In the quiet moments when Helena would pause, her gaze lost on the horizon where the wooden cross stood, Miranda's own eyes would soften with a flicker of understanding. She recognized the weight Helena carried, for she carried her own. The trust between them was not built on words or promises, but on this shared, silent acknowledgement of pain. It grew like the seedlings they planted, a fragile green shoot pushing its way through the cold ground of their pasts, a silent promise to stay. The work was hard, a race against the light. One afternoon, as the sun began its descent, casting long golden shadows across the field, exhaustion hit Helena like a physical blow. 15 years of grief and grinding work had taken their toll, hollowing her out in ways she rarely admitted even to herself. She rose from her knees, a wave of dizziness washing over her, the world tilting on its axis. Her foot caught on a stone, and she stumbled, a sharp gasp escaping her lips. Before she could fall, a hand, firm and warm, clamped onto her arm, steadying her. Helena's head came up, and she found herself looking directly into Miranda's eyes. They were inches away, close enough to see the flecks of gold in their dark depths. The world fell away. There was no field, no setting sun, no memory of a dead husband or a lost family. There was only this gaze. It was not pity she saw there, nor mere concern. It was a profound, searching tenderness, a current of warmth that flowed from Miranda's hand, up Helena's arm, and straight into the frozen center of her chest. It was a look that saw past the weathered rancher, past the grieving widow, and into the woman who had been buried for so long. The touch lingered, a brand of heat on her skin. Helena's heart, which had beat a slow, funereal rhythm for a decade and a half, began to hammer against her ribs with a wild, terrifying force. This feeling was not the protective fire she'd felt at the auction, nor the quiet respect earned through shared work. This was something else entirely, something she had sworn she would never feel again. It was the stirrings of a new season in her own soul, a thaw so powerful it threatened to break her apart. In that prolonged, silent exchange, A terrifying and beautiful truth bloomed in the ruins of her heart. She was coming to care for this woman, not as a mission, not as a responsibility, but with the kind of love she thought had been laid in the grave forever. The season of new beginnings had finally claimed the Wild West. The air, thick with the smell of damp earth and budding cottonwoods, no longer carried the bite of winter. Under the gentle hand of spring, the ranch had transformed. The harsh lines of its fences softened, and the land, once a vast and lonely expanse of white, was now alive with the tender green of new growth. It was no longer a fortress of solitude, but a shared haven, a quiet home, where two lives had intertwined as surely as the vines now climbing the porch railing. The evenings had grown longer, softer. They sat together on the porch steps, a ritual that had replaced the silent meals inside. The sun bled across the horizon, painting the sky in hues of soft rose and deep violet. For 15 years, Helena had watched this same sunset alone, a daily reminder of another day endured, another day closer to nothing. Now, sitting so close to Miranda that their shoulders nearly brushed, the silence was not an emptiness, but a form of peace, a comfortable quiet that needed no words. The hard work of planting was done for the day, and in the stillness, a different kind of growth was taking place. Helena turned her head slightly, her gaze falling on Miranda's profile against the fading light. She saw the elegant line of her jaw, the way her dark hair caught the last rays of the sun. She saw the quiet dignity that was Miranda's armor and her truth. In the months they had lived together, Helena had witnessed a strength that ran deeper than any river, a spirit that no auction block could ever break. A profound sense of gratitude washed over her, so potent it felt like an ache in her chest. As if feeling her stare, Miranda turned to meet her gaze. Her eyes, dark and deep, held the reflection of the painted sky, but they were fixed on Helena. In their depths, Helena saw it all. The shared understanding of loss, the fragile trust that had been built one day at a time, one quiet gesture after another. The space between them, once a chasm of silence and sorrow, was now charged with an energy that was both terrifying and undeniable. Slowly, as if moving through water, Helena leaned in. It was an instinct, a pull as natural and powerful as the turning of the earth. Miranda did not flinch or pull away. She met her halfway, her eyes fluttering shut as their lips met. The touch was tentative, a trembling question. It was softer than anything Helena had known, yet it shattered the last of her defenses with the force of a landslide. It was the taste of spring after a lifetime of winter, a spark of warmth on skin long accustomed to the cold. A shock went through Helena, so violent it was almost painful. Her heart, a slow and tired muscle, began to beat with a wild, frantic rhythm against her ribs. Fear warbled with a longing so sharp it stole her breath. Suddenly, the image of the simple wooden cross on the hill burned behind her eyes. Her husband, her son, the faces of the family she had lost, the love she had buried, rushed into the space that this kiss had created. Grief, her most faithful companion for 15 years, rose up like a phantom, its cold hands wrapping around her throat. This felt like a betrayal of their memory, of the silent vow she had made to stay alone with her pain. She pulled back, a sharp gasp of air tearing from her lungs. Her eyes flew open, wide with panic. The world was tilting, but Miranda's hand came up, not to pull her back, but to rest gently on her arm. Her touch was an anchor in the storm. It was warm, firm, and real. Helena looked into Miranda's face and saw no fear, no confusion. She saw only a deep, unwavering tenderness, a profound trust that held no judgment for Helena's panic. In that moment, Miranda's wariness, the last shadow of the auction block and the brutal world that had put her there, seemed to melt away completely, replaced by an offer of pure, unconditional sanctuary. That gentle touch, that steady gaze, was a revelation. It did not try to erase the past or replace the dead. It simply offered a place to stay in the present. Helena saw that her mission had been flawed. She had thought her purpose was to tend to a grave, to live out her years as a monument to her dead family. But this woman, this impossible gift of the Wild West, was showing her a different truth. The work of love was not to die with the past, but to have the courage to build a future. The fear did not vanish, but it receded, making way for something stronger. Surrendering, Helena leaned forward again, her hand rising to cup Miranda's cheek. She closed the distance between them, and this time, the kiss was not a question. It was an answer. It was a promise. It was the choice to step away from the grave and into the warmth of a new spring, knowing there was no turning back from the bond they had forged in the heart of silence. The kiss ended, but the connection did not break. They remained on the porch steps, bathed in the deep purple twilight of the Wild West, the space between them humming with a life of its own. The world had gone quiet, waiting. Slowly, Helena drew back, her hand still cupped against Miranda's cheek, the warmth of her skin a miracle against her calloused palm. She looked into Miranda's eyes and saw a reflection of her own fragile hope. It was a terrifying and beautiful sight, a home offered in a single gaze. Without a word, Helena stood, her movements stiff with the weight of the moment. She held out her hand. Miranda took it, her fingers lacing through Helena's with a trust that felt both ancient and brand new. Together they left the burgeoning spring night and stepped back into the quiet shelter of the cabin. The air inside was cool, thick with the lingering scent of wood smoke and their shared life. Helena moved as if in a dream, lighting the single lantern on the main table. The flame caught, casting a pool of soft golden light that pushed the shadows into the corners of the room, creating an intimate island for just the two of them. In this flickering circle of light, the vast, lonely ranch, the silent grave on the hill, and the cruel world that had brought them together all fell away. There was only this room, this silence, this woman. They faced each other, their hands still linked. The silence was no longer a void but a vessel, filled with everything that had led them to this moment. Helena saw the story of Miranda's survival not in scars, but in the profound stillness of her spirit, a strength that had refused to be broken. And in Helena's own weathered face, in the deep lines etched by years of grief, Miranda saw a woman who had finally chosen to stay among the living. The first touch was a continuation of the kiss, a slow exploration. Helena raised her free hand to brush a stray strand of hair from Miranda's face, her fingers trembling slightly as they traced the line of her jaw. It was an act of discovery, of learning the shape of this person who had rebuilt her world. Miranda leaned into the touch, her eyes closing, a quiet sigh escaping her lips. It was a sound of surrender, not of defeat, but of finally laying down a weapon she had been forced to carry for too long. Their union was a slow, sacred act performed in the heart of that silence. It was a language spoken not with words, but with the careful press of skin against skin, a mapping of old wounds and a promise of new beginnings. For Helena, the warmth of Miranda's body against hers was a balm on a burn she'd carried for 15 years. In the safety of Miranda's arms, the ghosts of her dead husband and son did not vanish, but their sharp, accusing edges softened. They faded into a gentle, sorrowful memory, no longer a barrier to life, but a part of the love she was now learning to give again. She was not betraying her past, she was honoring the life they would have wanted for her. For Miranda, this was the ultimate expression of trust. In Helena's quiet strength, in her gentle, reverent touch, she found a sanctuary she thought she would never know again. This was a home built not of wood and stone, but of mutual respect and a shared understanding of pain. Here, in this bed, she was not the Apache woman from the auction block, not a victim. She was simply Miranda, a woman being loved. Later, as the lantern flame guttered and died, plunging the room into the soft darkness of a moonless night, Helena lay awake. Miranda slept beside her, her breathing a slow, steady rhythm that was the most beautiful sound Helena had ever heard. It was the sound of peace, the sound of family. But with this peace came a vulnerability so raw, it felt like an open wound. For 15 years she had lived alone, her heart encased in the ice of her grief. It had been a hard and lonely existence, but it had been safe. No one could hurt her because she had nothing left to lose. Now, lying here, feeling the warmth of Miranda beside her, she knew that was no longer true. She had everything to lose. This new love, this fragile future they were building, was a tender seedling in the harsh terrain of the Wild West. 1,000 things could destroy it. A cold fear gripped her, the familiar phantom of loss. But as she turned her head, her gaze tracing the outline of Miranda's form in the gloom, something else rose to meet it. It was a feeling she recognized from the day she had first seen that sagging coop gate repaired. It was respect, admiration, and something more, a fierce primal resolve. Her old mission had been to tend a grave, a duty to the dead. She saw now that it had been an act of hiding. Her new mission, her true mission, was to protect this living, breathing love at all costs. It was a vow made not to the ghosts of the past, but to the promise of the future sleeping soundly beside her. The fear was real, but the love was realer, and for the first time in a long, long time, Helena Eastwood was ready to fight for the spring. The Wild West had surrendered to the full bloom of spring. The land around the ranch, once a harsh, monochromatic expanse, was now a tapestry of vibrant life. The air was sweet with the scent of clover and damp earth, and the creek, freed from its prison of ice, whispered a constant soothing song. For years Helena had seen the return of spring as an indifferent cycle, a season that offered renewal to a world that had taken everything from her, but now she saw it through different eyes. The ranch was no longer a monument to the dead. It was a living, breathing home, its pulse matching the steady presence of Miranda beside her. The love that had taken root in the frozen silence of winter was now blossoming, a fragile and beautiful thing in the warm sun. But the world was larger than their sanctuary, and its shadows were long. Whispers, like dandelion seeds on a bitter wind, drifted from the nearby town. They were ugly things, carried on the tongues of men who had been at the auction and the wives who had heard the stories. The news of two women living together, one a white widow, the other an Apache, was a stone dropped into the placid, prejudiced waters of the community. Helena felt the change on a rare solo trip for Salt. The stares were no longer just curious. They were hard, laced with a cold judgment that followed her from the livery to the general store. The silence that met her was not respectful, but hostile. She returned to the ranch that day with a chill that had nothing to do with the weather, a grim understanding that their peace was a fragile bubble. They began to stay within the borders of their land, their shared world shrinking back to the fences that had once defined Helena's loneliness and now protected their love. The inevitable came when the flour barrel was empty and the lamp oil was gone. The trip could not be postponed. Helena prepared the buckboard with a heavy heart, the familiar work of checking the harnesses doing nothing to soothe the knot of dread in her stomach. She meant to go alone, to face the town's venom and shield Miranda from it, but Miranda met her by the barn, her expression resolute. She said nothing, but her meaning was clear in the square of her shoulders and the firm set of her jaw. I will not hide. We will not hide. And so they went together, a united front, their silence on the ride into town, a shared armor against the coming storm. The confrontation happened on the wooden boardwalk outside the mercantile. Helena had just stepped out, a heavy sack of flour over one shoulder, when a small group blocked her path. It was the greasy-vested auctioneer, the leering trapper, and two women whose faces were pinched with self-righteous certainty. Miranda stood just behind Helena, a still, quiet presence at her back. Eastwood, the auctioneer said, his voice stripped of its booming showmanship, and now just mean. We need a word. Helena shifted the weight of the flour sack, her gaze as cold and flat as a frozen pond. I have nothing to say to you. Folks are talking. The trapper sneered, his eyes flicking to Miranda. Talking about what you're doing out there with that savage. The word hung in the air, a raw and deliberate cruelty. Helena felt a surge of white-hot fury, a protective instinct so powerful it was a physical force. It was the same fire she'd felt at the auction, but this was no longer about principle. This was personal. This was about the woman whose hand she had held in the dark, the woman who had taught her heart to beat again. This was about her family. One of the town's women, a baker's wife with hard, pious eyes, stepped forward. It's unnatural, Helena. You were a good wife once, a grieving widow. We all felt for you. But this is a sickness. You're bringing a dark element into our town. Helena looked at their faces, a gallery of fear and ignorance. For 15 years she had weathered their pity and their indifference. Now she had to weather their hatred. Her old mission had been to endure. Her new mission was to defend. She set the flour sack down with a soft thud. The only dark element I see is right here on this street, she said, her voice low and steady, cutting through their bluster. She took a half-step back, positioning herself more squarely in front of Miranda, a living shield. Her gaze met each of theirs in turn, holding it until they looked away. What I do on my ranch is my business. Who I share my home with is my business. She paused, the silence stretching, drawing all the air from the space between them. You will stay away from my land, and you will stay away from her. She let the threat settle, unspoken, but perfectly understood. Then she turned her back on them, an act of dismissal more profound than any shout. She looked at Miranda, whose eyes shone with a fierce, quiet pride. Without a word, they walked to the buckboard, loaded their supplies, and left the town and its poison behind them. The ride home was silent, but it was a different silence now. It was the quiet of soldiers after the first battle, the grim understanding that the war had just begun. The spring had brought life back to the Wild West, but it had also brought the fight to their door, and Helena knew, with a certainty that settled deep in her bones, that she would burn the whole world down to protect the home they had built in the heart of it. The peace of the ranch was a fragile thing, a single candle flame in the vast, dark expanse of the Wild West. In the deep of the night, with Miranda sleeping beside her, Helena felt its warmth as a living presence. The quiet rhythm of Miranda's breathing was the sound of a home rebuilt, a heart resurrected. For the first time in 15 years, the silence in the cabin was not an emptiness to be endured, but a sanctuary, complete and whole. It was a peace so profound Helena feared it could not possibly last. The world broke without a sound. It was not a crash of a door, but a sudden shift in the air, a cold draft where none should be. Helena came awake with a jolt, every nerve alight with a primal alarm. Shadows detached themselves from the deeper shadows of the room, dark, lean figures moving with a silent, predatory grace. Before a scream could form in her throat, a rough hand clamped over her mouth, and a heavy weight forced her back against the mattress. She fought, a wild animal thrashing, her fists and feet finding only hard muscle and unyielding resolve. Across the small room, Miranda was being pulled from the bed. Two men, their faces grim and set like stone in the slivers of moonlight, hauled her to her feet. She did not cry out. Her struggle was a fierce, contained thing, a powerful resistance that was met with brutal efficiency. Helena's view was a nightmare collage of tangled limbs and dark fabric. She saw Miranda's face for a fleeting second, not terrified, but ablaze with a defiant fury. Her eyes found Helena's over the shoulder of one of her captors, and in that gaze was a universe of silent, frantic meaning. Stay. Live. The hand over Helena's mouth tightened. The man holding her down was a mountain, immovable. All her years of hard ranch work were nothing against him. Rage, pure and undiluted, surged through her, a molten core of fury at her own helplessness. They were taking her family. They were taking her love. They were dragging her future out into the night, and she could do nothing but watch. As they forced Miranda through the doorway and into the darkness, a small piece of the deerskin dress she wore caught on the latch and tore away, falling unnoticed to the floorboards. Then they were gone, and the man holding Helena released her, melting back into the night as silently as he had come. Helena scrambled from the bed, gasping, her throat raw. The cabin was empty. The bed beside her was a cold, gaping wound. The silence that rushed back in was monstrous, a suffocating void that mocked the peace it had replaced. For a single shattering moment, the grief of 15 years ago converged with the terror of now, threatening to pull her under. The grave on the hill, the dead wife she had been, the lost family. It was all happening again. But this was different. The rage that had been smothered moments before now roared to life, consuming the grief. This was not a fate to be accepted. This was a theft to be answered. Her old mission had been to quietly tend a grave, to honor the dead by remaining alone with them. That life, that Helena, was gone. Her new mission burned in her blood, hot and clear, to bring Miranda home. She didn't wait for the dawn. Fueled by a cold, purposeful fury, she dressed, her hands steady. The work was familiar, a litany against despair. She pulled on her sturdiest boots. She took down the rifle from its pegs over the mantel, its weight a grim comfort in her hands. She moved through the pre-dawn gloom with a certainty that left no room for fear. The trust Miranda had given her was a sacred thing, and it would not be broken. As the first pale light of morning bled over the horizon, painting the sky in cruel, beautiful shades of rose, Helena was already outside. She found their tracks leading away from the cabin, a clear trail of several men and the scuff marks of a struggle. Her eyes, trained by years of living on this land, followed the path, and there, just beyond the porch, snagged on a low-growing sagebrush, was the proof her heart refused to accept, a small torn scrap of deerskin. She knelt, her fingers closing around the soft, familiar fabric. It was still warm, or so it seemed to her. Holding it, the last piece of the home they had built together, her carefully controlled rage finally fractured, and a single, sharp shard of pure terror pierced her through. She had found something to lose again, a love greater than her fear of pain. And now the world had taken it. Rising to her feet, she looked out at the trail disappearing into the vast, indifferent landscape of the Wild West. Her heart was splintering, but her resolve was hardening into steel. She would follow that trail to the end of the earth. She would fight, and she would bring her family back. The spring had come, and she was ready for the war. The trail was a brutal scar across the Wild West, a testament to the haste and cruelty of the men who had taken Miranda. For days, Helena followed it, the memory of Miranda's eyes in the dark, her silent plea to live, a fire in her belly that burned hotter than exhaustion. The scrap of deerskin she clutched in her pocket was a talisman, a tangible piece of the love she refused to lose. This was a different kind of mission. Her life had been a long, quiet surrender to the dead. This was a war for the living. The land she had known for years in solitude now tested her, its canyons hiding false paths, its rivers threatening to wash away the tracks. But Helena's resolve was harder than the rock beneath her feet. She read the signs, a broken twig, a disturbed stone, with the singular focus of a predator. This was her land, and it would not hide her family from her. She found them in a high, wind-scoured basin, just as the sun began to dip below the jagged peaks. A small encampment of Apache men stood in a solemn circle. In the center, Miranda was being bound not with rope, but with ceremonial strips of painted leather, to a man Helena had never seen, his face stern and proprietary. It was a ritual, cold and inexorable. They were not simply taking her back. They were erasing her, forcing her back into a life she had not chosen. They were taking her home, but it was not her home anymore. Fear, cold and sharp, tried to paralyze her. She was one woman, with one rifle against a dozen. But as she saw Miranda's face, still and proud even in this final moment of her freedom, the fear was burned away by a love so fierce it was a weapon in its own right. Helena stepped from the cover of the rocks, not with her rifle raised, but with her hands open. Her voice, when it came, was not a shout, but a raw, aching plea that carried across the basin. "Stay," she called out, the word directed only at Miranda. It was the first word she had ever spoken to her, a plea that held the weight of all their shared silence, all their shared work. "Stay with me." Heads turned. The men stared, their faces a mixture of shock and contempt. Miranda's eyes locked with hers, and in them, Helena saw the flicker of a fire that had not been extinguished. With a sudden, violent twist of her body, Miranda tore her arm from the grasp of the man beside her. She didn't run. She walked, deliberate and unwavering, across the circle and straight to Helena. The choice was made. It was not a rescue. It was a declaration. They fled into the twilight, two women against the world. They didn't look back. They rode for days, pushing themselves and their horse past the point of breaking, leaving behind both the town with its poisoned whispers and the tribe with its rigid traditions. They were truly alone now, cast out from every world but the one they could make for themselves. They sought a place the world had not yet claimed, a valley whispered about by old trappers, a pocket of green hidden deep in the mountain's embrace. They found it as spring reached its zenith, a sweep of land nestled between protective peaks, a creek running clear and cold through a meadow of wild flowers. Here, they stopped. The work began again, but this time it was not a litany against grief, but a hymn of creation. Together they built a small, sturdy cabin, their hands moving in the familiar, unspoken rhythm of their partnership. They were not just building a shelter, they were building a future. One evening, as they sat by their new hearth, Miranda took Helena's hand and placed it gently on her own belly. The gesture was quiet, simple, and it changed everything. Helena felt the slight, firm swell beneath her palm and understood. A new life. A child conceived not in sorrow but in the improbable love that had blossomed in the silence. It was the ultimate trust, the final mending of two fractured souls. Tears streamed down Helena's face, not of grief, but of a joy so profound it was painful. This child was their shared healing, the tangible promise that from the deepest wounds, a new family could grow. Their ranch was small, their life simple, but it was theirs. The silence of their past was finally filled, not just by the whisper of the wind through the pines, but by the promise of laughter. Standing on their porch one evening, hand in hand, they watched the sun set over their valley. The sky was a canvas of impossible color. The scars they both carried, from the grave on the hill to the auction block, were not gone, but they were no longer heavy burdens. They were simply the marks of a long and difficult journey to this very spot, to this peace, to this love. They had found their home, not on a map, but in each other. And for the first time in a lifetime, the horizon looked not like an ending, but a beginning.